A bankrupt black widower bought a 19-year-old girl who was being auctioned off by her father and mother. $20 for the last lot of the day. A healthy, obedient 19-year-old girl, announced the sheriff, his voice echoing across the dusty square in Lakewood Springs. The June sun beat down mercilessly as the townspeople watched, some in awkward silence, others with morbid interest in the grotesque spectacle unfolding before them. Isaiah Montgomery, a 42-year-old widower and the only black man who owned land in the area, stood at the back of the crowd with his fists clenched. The young woman on the small makeshift platform kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her disheveled hair partially covering a recent bruise on her cheek. Her parents, a couple worn down by a hard life, watched the scene with blank expressions. $25, shouted a hoarse voice from across the street. Frank Holloway, owner of the local tavern, raised his hand with a smile that did not hide his intentions. The girl trembled visibly. $30, a second voice piped up. Walter Schmidt, a farmer known for his violent temper, especially after a few drinks. Isaiah closed his eyes briefly. $30 was practically all he had left after the drought that had devastated his small plantation. It was the money he had set aside for seeds for the next season. It was his last chance to save the land he had worked so hard to acquire after his wife's death. $50. Isaiah's deep voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. An absolute silence fell over the square. Dozens of white faces turned simultaneously in his direction, expressions of shock and indignation barely contained. The girl's father narrowed his eyes, his mouth twisted in a mixture of contempt and greed. "I won't give my daughter to a..." $70, Isaiah interrupted, stepping closer to the center. "In gold coins. Now." The sheriff cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Montgomery, I don't think you..." "The law says any free man can participate in a public auction," Isaiah said, not looking away. "Unless you want to explain to a federal judge why you refused the highest bid." For the first time since the auction began, the young woman looked up. For a brief moment, her gaze met Isaiah's. There was no hope there, only resignation and a weariness too deep for someone so young. $70 once, the sheriff announced reluctantly. Holloway and Schmidt exchanged glances, but no one else bid. "Sold," the sheriff declared, banging his small gavel. The square erupted in indignant murmurs. As Isaiah approached to finalize the payment, flashes of memory assaulted him, his late wife Abigail being humiliated in the same square years ago when they tried to drive them out of town, the simple grave where she had been laid to rest 2 years ago, victim of pneumonia that no local doctor had been willing to treat, the suffocating loneliness of his cabin since then. The young woman stepped down from the platform with hesitant steps. Up close, Isaiah could see other older bruises on her arms. She kept her eyes down, as if she had learned the hard way that looking up meant punishment. "What is your name?" he asked, keeping a respectful distance. "Sarah," she replied in a whisper that was almost inaudible. "Sarah Collins." Isaiah nodded. "I'm Isaiah Montgomery." "I know who you are," she replied, surprising him. "Everyone does." As they began to walk away from the square, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. "Good God, they sold the girl to a black man. This won't end well. Someone should do something." Isaiah felt the weight of hostile glances like knives in his back. Sarah walked a step behind him, as if she had been trained to do so. As they passed the tavern, Frank Holloway spat on the ground. $70 is a high price for something you won't be able to keep for long, Montgomery, he taunted, loud enough for everyone to hear. Isaiah didn't respond. He continued walking toward the wagon parked at the edge of town, where his old horse waited patiently. As he helped Sarah climb up, he noticed that she was trembling, not from fear of him, but from something worse, the expectation of what was to come, based on everything she had already endured. "I won't hurt you," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "You have my word." For the first time, she looked him directly in the eye. His eyes reflected not only pain, but a spark of something Isaiah recognized immediately, the same quiet determination that had kept him alive in a world that wanted him dead. "Why?" she asked simply. Isaiah didn't answer right away. He started the wagon before saying, "Because I know what it's like to be treated like a commodity." As the wagon pulled away from the town under the hostile gaze of the residents, no one noticed the small metal object Sarah hid inside her worn shoe, nor the glance she exchanged briefly with a figure in the shadows. There was much more to this silent young woman than anyone could have imagined, something that would forever change the fate of Lakewood Springs. If stories of injustice, prejudice, and unlikely courage touch your heart, be sure to sign up to find out how Sarah's apparent desperation and Isaiah's risky compassion will spark a revolution that no one in that town will ever forget. Isaiah's cabin was 6 miles from town, isolated among parched fields and a small oak forest. By the time they arrived, the sun had set, plunging the landscape into blue shadows. Sarah silently surveyed the property, the modest but well-maintained structure, the small barn, the stone well surrounded by a garden ravaged by drought. "This is it," Isaiah said, climbing down from the wagon. "It's not much, but it's mine. No one will bother you here." Sarah remained motionless on the wagon, her eyes calculating distances, assessing escape routes like a cornered animal. When she finally got down, she kept several steps away from him. "There's a room in the back," Isaiah explained. "It was my son's. It has a lock on the inside." The mention of a son made Sarah frown. "Your son?" "Jacob died with his mother. Pneumonia, 2 winters ago," Isaiah replied, his voice devoid of self-pity. "He was 5. Inside the cabin, a lamp was already lit on the central table, a sign that someone had been there recently. Sarah noticed the detail, her posture instantly stiffening. "Wait here," Isaiah said, noticing her tension. He quickly inspected the house before relaxing. Ruth was here. She left food. At the name, Sarah reacted. "Ruth Wilkins? The midwife?" Isaiah nodded, surprised. "You know her?" "She delivered my mother once," Sarah replied evasively. The cabin was simple but organized with meticulous precision. Books lined perfectly on makeshift shelves. A cedar table darkened by time but polished to a shine. This wasn't the chaotic environment of a defeated man, it was the disciplined refuge of someone who refused to give up. "You intend to run tonight, don't you?" Isaiah asked calmly during dinner. Sarah froze, her body tense as a violin string about to snap. "I don't blame you," he continued. "But there are 3 men patrolling the eastern forest. Bounty hunters hired by the mayor after 3 slaves escaped from the Sullivan plantation." "I'm not a slave," Sarah retorted. "No, you're not." Isaiah agreed. "But try explaining that to those men in the dark." The next morning, Sarah found the house empty and the door unlocked. She was not a prisoner. Through the window, she saw Isaiah working in the parched garden, trying to revive dying plants with water from the well. While searching the house for money or valuables, Sarah found something unexpected, a book of federal laws marked in several places with meticulous notes. Next to it were letters signed by a Professor Williams from Boston University. Before she could investigate further, she heard horses approaching. 3 horsemen rode onto the property. Sarah recognized Frank Holloway, accompanied by Walter Schmidt and a third man who was elegantly dressed and had a calculatedly friendly expression. Isaiah dropped his hoe and walked toward them, standing tall, his face impassive. "Montgomery," Holloway said with false cordiality. "We've come to introduce Mr. Davis, the new county judge." The tall man bowed his head in a greeting that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Montgomery, I've heard a great deal about you." "We're conducting a property inspection," Judge Davis explained, "to update the county records." "My taxes are paid," Isaiah replied. "They always are." "It's not about taxes," Schmidt interjected with a malicious smile. "It's about suitability. Unproductive land may be requisitioned for more efficient use," Davis elaborated. Sarah watched Isaiah's jaw tighten, though his expression remained neutral. "This property has been registered in my name since 1869, with all the proper documents." "Times change, Montgomery," Holloway laughed. "Laws change." When the men finally left, Sarah confronted Isaiah. "They want your land." "They always have," he replied, returning to his work as if nothing had happened. "Why?" "It's practically ruined by the drought." Isaiah hesitated, "Because there's something here that's worth a lot more than a few acres of dry land." That afternoon, Ruth Wilkins arrived in her covered wagon. She was a middle-aged black woman with a formidable bearing and piercing eyes. She brought supplies, seeds, and news. "The new judge visited 5 properties today," she reported as she examined Sarah's bruises. "All belonging to blacks or immigrants." Isaiah nodded, as if merely confirming his suspicions. And this, Ruth handed him a sealed envelope, arrived today on the telegraph. Jenkins asked me to deliver it discreetly. As Isaiah read, his expression changed to cold determination. Sarah, he called. I need to know exactly what you heard at your father's meetings with Mayor Marshall. The shock on Sarah's face was momentary. How do you know about that? Why, Ruth interjected gently, you're not the first young woman we've tried to help escape that family. It was then that Sarah understood. She hadn't bought a girl at a cruel auction out of random compassion. The object in her shoe, a small ornate key, suddenly seemed infinitely heavier. My father keeps a red book locked in his desk, she finally revealed. Payment records, names, dates. Mayor Marshall is organizing something big. Something involving Judge Davis and land along the river. Isaiah and Ruth exchanged glances. Is that why her father was willing to auction her off so publicly? Sarah nodded, the first tear finally escaping. I've heard too much. I've seen too much. In town, rumors ran like wildfire, about the black man who dared to buy a white girl, about suspicious nighttime visitors to her property, about the proximity of the railroad line that would connect the county to the newly discovered mines. No one noticed the little red book missing from Mr. Collins's house, or the coded messages sent by telegraph late at night. What the powerful people of Lakewood Springs didn't know was that sometimes those considered invisible are the ones who can see best, and that the Rayall Revolution begins not with screams, but with whispers in the shadows and plans woven by hands that have nothing to lose, only a future to claim. For days after Judge Davis's visit, an unexpected storm broke over Lakewood Springs. No one noticed the small figure moving around the back of the town hall during the chaos, a dark cloak protecting her from prying eyes. Sarah Collins, whom everyone assumed was confined as Isaiah Montgomery's property, had infiltrated the heart of local power. The key in her shoe, stolen from her father's desk weeks earlier, finally found its purpose in the mayor's office. Meanwhile, Isaiah entered the telegraph office completely soaked. Jenkins, the operator with quiet sympathies for the marginalized, merely nodded. The wire is open to Boston, he said quietly, leaving Isaiah alone with the machine. The next morning, the sun shone mercilessly. Mayor Marshall, Judge Davis, and 3 wealthy farmers gathered at Holloway's Tavern, visibly tense. What do you mean disappeared? Hissed the mayor, pale as a ghost. Documents don't just disappear. The cabinet was locked, replied the judge, nervously tugging at his tie. No one but you has the key. Frank Holloway poured another round of whiskey. What about the black man? Montgomery? I always knew that guy was trouble. Impossible, Marshall dismissed. He would never enter City Hall unnoticed. What neither of them knew was that, at that very moment, 6 copies of the stolen documents were being posted at the entrances to the church, the market, and City Hall. Ruth Wilkins, with the calm demeanor of someone performing everyday tasks, was posting the papers that would expose the conspiracy, a scheme to expropriate strategic land before the official announcement of the railroad. When the church bells rang 10 o'clock, a special train arrived at the small station. 3 men in impeccable suits stepped off, a representative of the Continental Railroad Company, a federal officer from the Department of the Interior, and a reporter from the Boston Globe. They were greeted by Isaiah, who led them down Main Street, where a crowd was already gathering around the pamphlets. The buzz grew as ordinary citizens discovered the magnitude of the corruption documented in Collins' Red Book. It's a forgery, shouted Mayor Marshall, appearing at the tavern door. Fabricated lies. Including your signature on every page, Mayor? Asked the federal representative politely. Or perhaps the map detailing how you intended to divert the original railroad route to benefit illegally acquired land is forged? Walter Schmidt tried to escape through the back, only to find the sheriff blocking his way. Did you know? Schmidt asked incredulously. Not everything, replied the sheriff, but enough not to stop what's happening. The crowd was growing. Faces that would normally have looked away from Isaiah now stared at him with a mixture of shock and reluctant respect. But the real surprise came when Sarah emerged from the church, accompanied by Reverend Thornton. This young woman, announced the Reverend, at great personal risk, has provided crucial evidence of crimes that affect every citizen of this town. Sarah stood tall, her eyes meeting the furious gaze of her father, who had just arrived. You, Collins growled, lunging toward her. I wouldn't do that, the federal officer interjected. Your daughter has already provided us with enough details about how you and the mayor have forged property documents belonging to at least 7 families over the past 2 years. A telegram was delivered publicly to Judge Davis. The Massachusetts Bar Association has a keen interest in discovering how a man expelled for judicial misconduct is now serving as a judge in another state, the reporter noted. You can't do this, the mayor hissed, looking frantically around. This town belongs to me. Belonged, corrected the railroad representative. The Continental Company is particularly interested in finding out how our confidential plans were leaked prematurely. The chaos that ensued was meticulously documented. The mayor's failed escape attempt, Holloway's desperate confession, Collins' angry cries as officers confiscated the Red Book from her home. The most extraordinary moment came when Sarah confronted her father publicly. You sold me, she declared without flinching, as if I were less than human. Just as you sold the dignity of this town. Collins, cornered, revealed the extent of his cruelty. What did you expect? Your mother ran away because she couldn't bear to look at you, the living reminder of our mistake. You were never worth the air you breathed. The silence that followed was broken by Isaiah's calm voice. Every person in this square is worth exactly the same, Mr. Collins. This is the truth you tried to bury, that there is no price on human dignity. As the conspirators were taken into custody, the turmoil only grew. Some demanded immediate justice. Others, including some who would once have despised Isaiah, now sought to associate themselves with the moral victory. Few noticed the quiet conversation between the railroad representative and Isaiah, or how the federal officer carefully examined Montgomery's land deeds. No one noticed the glance exchanged between Ruth and Sarah when the reporter asked to interview them. The town had been shaken to its foundations, but one question remained in the air, whispered in the corners of the square as the crowd dispersed. How had a black man and a young woman who had been sold managed not only to survive but to defeat the powerful men who controlled every aspect of that society? The answer was written in the papers on display, in the letters exchanged with Boston, and in the plan that had begun long before the auction, a plan whose seeds had been planted years earlier, when a college professor met a former slave determined to change the world, one letter at a time. 6 months after the day that changed Lakewood Springs forever, the sun rose over a transformed town. The railroad station, once just a project used for manipulation, now stood real and imposing on the edge of Isaiah Montgomery's property. His land, far from being confiscated, had become the center of the new commercial route, a decision made by the Continental Company after discovering that the original route proposed by Mayor Marshall would cross unstable land. Isaiah's modest cabin now shared space with a school. What began as makeshift lessons for 3 black children, rejected by the city's educational system, quickly turned into an institution that attracted families from neighboring communities. Sarah Collins, or rather Sarah Montgomery, as she was now known after a simple wedding ceremony performed by Reverend Thornton, ran the classes with the same quiet determination that had brought down an empire of corruption. I never imagined I'd be teaching, she remarked one afternoon, watching the 20 students, black, white, and immigrant, under the large tree that served as their classroom on hot days. I was always the girl who could barely lift her eyes when someone spoke to her. Isaiah, who was building new tables for the main room, smiled. I always knew you had fire inside you. You just needed air to breathe. Former Mayor Marshall was serving time in the state penitentiary, convicted of fraud and extortion. Judge Davis, unmasked, had fled in the middle of the night, but rumors said he had been arrested in Chicago under a false name. Frank Holloway had lost his tavern to creditors and now worked as a longshoreman on a distant river. As for Sarah's father, Collins, public humiliation had led to a decline that turned him into a shadow of the man he once was, now living on favors, a pathetic figure whom everyone avoided. We've received a reply from Benson, Ruth Wilkins announced during the weekly dinner that brought together the core group responsible for transforming the town. Jenkins, the telegraph operator, and Sheriff Jensen, who had finally found the courage to be on the right side of history, completed the group. Benson, the Boston University professor who years earlier had recognized the legal brilliance of a self-taught former slave seeking to understand his rights. The same man who had suggested that Isaiah buy that particular piece of land, seemingly worthless, decades before the railroad became a reality. He accepts our proposal to expand the educational project, Ruth continued. 15 scholarships for young people from here. 15 lives transformed, Sarah murmured, her hand unconsciously touching the small scar on her wrist, a reminder of a previous life that seemed to belong to someone else. The next day, when the first commercial train officially pulled into Lakewood Springs Station, There was a small ceremony. The new mayor, an honest businessman elected after a special election, spoke words of progress and renewal. But all eyes were on the Montgomerys, standing discreetly to the side. "It's thanks to you," an elderly woman whispered to Sarah. The same lady who had looked away when she saw her on the street months ago. "My son got a job at the station. They would never have taken a boy like him before." Her son, a young man with one leg shorter than the other, waved cheerfully from across the platform, wearing his railroad uniform with pride. "We didn't do it alone," Sarah replied, smiling genuinely. "That's what they don't understand about justice," Isaiah explained later as they walked home under the orange evening sky. "It's not just about punishing the guilty. It's about building something better on the ruins." Sarah stopped, looking down at the city stretching out below them, lights beginning to flicker in the windows. "When I was on that platform being sold like an animal, all I wanted was revenge," she confessed. "I wanted everyone to suffer like I did." Isaiah nodded, understanding. "And now I understand that true freedom isn't just breaking chains. It's building a table where everyone can sit." She looked at the man who had risked everything for her, not out of pity, but out of principle. "They tried to convince us that we were worthless. That I was just a commodity and you were just an intruder on this land. And we ended up proving that our value was never for sale," Isaiah added. On the horizon, the towers of the new train station stood out against the flaming sky, a symbol of an economy that now benefited everyone, not just the powerful. In the schoolrooms, maps and books promised futures that had been unimaginable just a few months earlier. And in City Hall, where schemes of exploitation had once been hatched, a diverse council now met weekly to discuss community improvements. Neither of them could have predicted how that desperate act in a dusty square, a black man buying a young woman at auction, would become the spark that would not only ignite the established corruption, but also light a fire that now illuminated hundreds of lives. The real revolution, Isaiah used to tell his students, is not tearing down walls, but building bridges where there were once only chasms. In a society built on divisions, Isaiah and Sarah had proven that true human dignity transcends race, class, and circumstance, that when people deemed inferior refuse to accept the limitations imposed on them by others, entire worlds can be transformed. "They tried to break us," Sarah would tell new students on their first day of class, "but they forgot that sometimes broken things reflect light in ways that whole things never could." If stories of social transformation, courage in the face of injustice, and the triumph of the human spirit over oppressive systems touch your heart, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more narratives that remind us of an eternal truth. A person's value can never be defined by how much others are willing to pay for her, but by how much she is willing to fight for what she believes in.